So welcome back to the final episode of the campaign. As promised, we'll come back in the winter. We're going to try and catch you some fish. On these Snake Lake venues, obviously the biggest thing is location. So today I'm going to run you through where you need to be fishing, what baits you need to be fishing, which is going to be bread and maggots. Fish tend to not want to feed as much in the winter, so you've got to go to the fish, try and locate them, and try and feed minimal bait and try and maximise the most out of your peg. So looking at this peg, obviously in recent weeks it's not been a great peg, it's not been doing that well. That's probably because of the fact that it's shallow. The fish like a little bit more depth below them, they like to huddle up and ball up in the winter. So the more bigger expanse of water you've got, the more chance you've got of more fish sitting in your peg. So when you actually look at this peg itself, you've got a brilliant reed bed across, you've got some broken reeds to your left and some broken reeds to your right. It looks absolutely perfect for dobbing bread, but I'm going to talk to you why they don't want to be in that area. And a lot of you might think, well, hold on a minute, surely you dob bread up to the far bank and you've got a big weed bed, the fish will sit in it. But you know, that's what I'm going to explain to you today. So whereabouts the fish live, what baits we're going to be fishing, you know, the rigs, the elastics, the hooks, the pots, everything you sort of need to know about winter fishing. And if we get lucky and they don't back away from us, which is typical when you sit on your own in winter, you know, we might be able to catch you a few fish as well for the camera. So to kickstart the session, what I need to do is get a picture of my peg in my head and know where I can dob my bread. So what I'm looking for here is the bottom of the slope, i.e. the deep water, and where the shallow water is. So in my head, I can picture an imaginary line. The shelf is, say, 2 foot off the reeds, and it goes all the way along and it follows it nice. So I'll show you what I mean. I've set my rig to sort of 4 and a bit foot, which this peg, right down the centre of the track, is probably 3 or 4 inches deeper than that. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to ship out a little bit, keep plumbing up. It's about 1.5 inches, 2 inches shallower. Again, I'm still just off the bottom there, I'm still in the deep water, and then you'll see here now, my body is just out of the water. Now, if I push, so lift my rig, make sure that I'm not dragging it against the shelf. If I push another foot further over, you can see it comes up about 18 inches. Now, that's me on top of the shelf, if you like to call it. So I've got a line on top of the shelf, and then if I come back, so on my number 8, halfway down my number 8 section, about 11 metres, that's where the deep water is. Now, in my head now, I'm looking, I'm thinking, right, that's about a metre and a bit off them reeds. If I follow this across my peg now and have another little plumb up, I'll see I'm still in the deep water. If I push a foot further over, the shelf comes up again. So what I'm going to do is try and plumb my peg so that I know, right, that is the deep water and that is my imaginary line. Using little markers, so say for example, the shadow of them reeds ends just on the end of my pole float from where I'm sat, and I know that's the deep water. If I go into the reeds, for example, so say like there, I'm coming up on top of the shelf. So I'm picturing these little markers in my head so that I know I'm basically always in the deep water. So my first starting point is probably going to be in the shallow water, but if it's a day where it's cold, what will happen is the fish will ball up and they'll ball up in the deep water. Now, the reason they'll do this is because, as you can see, when I go right up to these reeds, it's probably half depth of what I've got down the middle. Now let's say that's 2 foot and a couple of inches. You imagine a carp's 5-6 pound, which is potential to catch on here. That's going to take up half the volume of that water column. So you can only fit a tiny amount of fish in one area. You can only have 4 or 5 carp of that size, and they will take up most of that area. So what them carp want to do is they want to sit where it's a bit deeper, they've got more room, more fish can huddle together, more fish can shoal up, and that way they can ball up and they feel safety in numbers. And that's exactly what happens when the water goes clear. They want to feel safe. Sat in 2 foot of water where there ain't much room for them to move about, they don't feel as safe. So knowing what I know now, I've picked my marker there. I'm going to come back, and on my pole I hook my rig up. I'll just marry it up for now, so that there, and then I take my float, and I know it's about 1 inch deeper. So what I would do, take my little Tipex pen here, and I'd roughly mark my depth. So I'd say, right, that's the bottom of the far shelf. And if I'm going to dob along that far shelf now, I've got to try and picture in my head where I think them fish will be sat. So, for example, if that's my full depth there, which is probably 4 foot, and this is why this peg's a little bit dodgy at this time of the year, it's not very deep. If I come a foot off the bottom, I'm going to be fishing sort of like 3 foot deep. So my starting point for going along that far shelf would be a foot off the bottom. Now when I marry that up to my depth marker, I know, right, I'm a foot off the bottom. If I'm not getting any bites, I can go a little bit deeper. So I know I'm 8 inches off the bottom. What I've got to be careful of is don't push too far over. If I push too far over, all of a sudden, I'm on the bottom with my bread. So then what I do on my second line, once I've marked that up and I know, right, that's full depth, I pull my float down, I go and plumb up again, I go and plumb that far bank. So I'm just going to put about another 6 or 8 inch on that to start with. So now I'm looking for the second place to potentially dob. So we'll go up to them reeds. You can see there I'm just off the bottom, so probably an inch off the bottom. So again, when I come back in, I'm going to use this as, you know, it's all relevant to how deep the lake actually is. If the lake's pretty deep, you probably have to dob deeper. If the lake's pretty shallow, you obviously dob a little bit shallower. So you can see there, I've got my bulk already set. It's already in a good position, that. So if I shallow up 6 or 8 inch, and my float sits on top of that bulk, I would basically then be like probably a quarter of the way off the bottom. So 8 inches, 32 inch, 2.5 foot, I'm starting a quarter of the way off the bottom. It doesn't matter whether it's 3 foot, whether it's 8 foot. I would say if you fish around about 20-25% or whatever the depth is, so for example if it's 8 foot deep, you might want to fish like 5-6 foot deep dobbing. The fish might sit a little bit deeper. If it's shallower, you might catch them a little bit shallower. So today, it's quite a shallow peg this. We've got 2.5 foot across. We're going to start at just under 2 foot. So 8 inches off the bottom, that then is where I'm going to dob. So again, I'll take my plummet, and I've already marked this, but I'd mark it, for example, and I know, right, that's across, that's bottom of the deep water, and that's now means that I can dob that depth across. If I want to go deeper, I can push my float up, marry it up to my marker. Yeah, I'm 8 inches off the bottom, and I can dob along that far slope as well. Where do I start the session then? Well, I've got them 2 lines dobbing as I spoke about, one in the deeper water, one in the shallow water. The first thing I want to do is go to the most obvious part of my peg where I might get a bite, because dobbing is all about location. The biggest thing when you're dobbing is you don't want to waste time. You can be dobbing about trying to find these fish, and before you know it, an hour of your match is gone. 20% of that 5 hours is gone, or your pleasure session, whatever you're doing, and you're just wasting time really. So try and locate the fish, and if the fish back away, you can always follow them by adding more sections on, or if you're fishing with rod and line, chucking a little bit further. But on these type of snake lakes, we're going to chase the fish as they move out of our peg. If they're not here to start with, we need to get where they are as quickly as possible. We don't want to be dobbing around an area for an hour. What you'll find is when you drop it right in front of the fish, your bites will be pretty instant. If you're in that little vicinity where the fish are, you will get a bite within the first minute of dropping your bread in. So it's quite an instant response, but very quickly you might catch a fish and then they're gone. So I'm going to start in the shallow water up to the cover, because if there's any fish lingering around them cover, I could get off to a nice quick start. So that's why I'm going to start. Fish tend to back away from any sort of feed if they don't want to feed. So what I try not to do is feed anything at the start of my match. Start off with my dobbing, and then if I start catching, great. If I don't, then I'll start introducing bait. But if you're catching dobbing, what you don't want to be doing is introducing piles of bait here, there and everywhere, so that the fish don't want to sit over them and back off out of your peg. If you can catch dobbing without feeding anything, you will catch a much bigger weight than you would feeding, because when you're feeding, you tend to foul up fish and things like that. But dobbing is one of the easiest, most efficient ways of catching fish in winter. So to start with, another thing that's really important is the size of your bread. Obviously with our punches we do 6, 8, 10 and 12 mil. The only punch I ever use for this style of fishing when I'm dobbing on the pole is a 6 mil. The only time I would ever use an 8mm if I was fishing for really big fish and say roach was a problem or something like that. But on here, if you fish an 8mm, you tend to miss a lot of bites or don't get bites. So for me, the 6mm is really important, and it's important to have a true 6mm. Some punches, they say the 6mm, but your bread actually swells up and becomes really, really big. So that's one thing you've got to pay attention to. So I've got my little punch box here. I'm going to take a piece of bread, I'm going to punch it out, and what I always do is I put it on my knee then and compress it. And then what'll happen is it'll stay on my knee. I can put my punch back in my box, shut my lid, take my hook, and when I hook my bread, I want to hook it as deep as possible. So I put my hook right in the centre of the bread, put the point into the bread, fold it over, and then my bread's ready to go. So starting wise, I'm going to go right to the centre of the weed bed. If I don't catch there, I can move about very quickly. Now I've plumbed all along that far bank, and I know it's all basically the same depth within an inch or two. So I'm starting around about 6 inches off the bottom, 8 inches off the bottom here. So first thing I want to do is get my float, drop it. So I'm probably a couple of inches off that cover, just imagining that's where the fish are roughly going to, you know, circulate and swim around. So a couple of little indications straight away. I'm guessing they're probably going to be little nuisance fish like rudd and stuff. But you never know, we might just bury straight away and we catch one. So yeah, we're getting a few little signs of rudd and things like that. Unless there's a million F1s there. So I'm just going to drop it 6 inches to the right. Again, on top of that shelf, not mega tight to the cover. I can always go tighter to the cover. But to start with, I just want to see if there's anything lingering in front of it. Again, another little indication. I'm guessing they're rudd, so what I'm going to do now, just try another little spot. Because I'm pretty convinced with them bites, with bread bites, because your bait's suspended off the bottom, it's normally really positive and fast bite. So all them little stabby pulls, I would imagine they're rudd them. It is like an area where there has been a lot of rudd in recent weeks, and that's probably because of the cover, the rudd are hanging about it. You tend to find that when you drop your rig in, you're not getting mithered by them little fish like rudd, you know, you've got a better chance that there'll be a bigger fish there, and that's why the rudd are not there. So, you know, don't be frightened of moving your bread about. And you can see how quick I move that about, you know, a couple of little quick signs, just dropped it in somewhere else. Now here, I've not had any of them little signs, so, you know, was the rudd, I can always drop back there. I'm going to pick that rig up, I'm going to go back to where I started, just see what happens. And you can see the length of line I've got as well, like a nice long line, trying to keep that rig away from the fish. Trying not to spook them, the water's very clear, don't want them seeing that pole tip. So again, lots of little signs on my float, probably small fish pecking away at the bread. We'll touch upon the rig a little bit later on, but you want that nice slow fall. With this, it's all about visibility, letting the fish see the bait falling, but you still have to be within a certain area. You know, if you're a metre away from the fish, you're probably too far away. You need to be within a foot of the fish, and hopefully they'll see it and then they'll go for it. They won't actively swim after your bait. You know, they're not going to chase your bait like they would do in, say, the summer months. This time of the year, you know, you've got to be right on where the fish are. Again, lots of little signs there. I'm just going to drop it in a bit more to the right, see what's happening over here. Got a feeling there could be a little nest of rudd sort of in that middle of the weed bed, because we didn't get many signs on the left hand side. Let's try this right hand side of the weed bed, see what happens over here. This is what I'm saying, like very quickly time can pass you by doing this, so you have to be actively on the move, try and locate them fish as quickly as possible. So you can imagine, let's say we're getting mithered by rudd there, I can go down to my next sort of weed bed. So I can think to myself, right, let's have a little go over here, see if there's any rudd, you know, lingering over this side near these reeds. They're a little bit more broken up, they're not as dense as that weed bed. So there's a possibility that fish could swim in and amongst these reeds, in and out of them. Now the decision I've got to make is, do I think the fish are on top of the shelf? Once I've been across all this cover, if I still haven't caught nothing and I've sort of covered my peg as quickly as possible, then it'd be a case of going a little bit deeper, dropping into that deep water and just see if them fish are sat hugging that shelf. Because even though it's not a feature looking at it from here, it's an underwater feature. That shelf is going to offer fish cover, and that little bit extra depth might just mean that the fish are actually sat down the track, which is a common thing on these lakes. They do tend to want to sit where it's a bit deeper. It's only when you get, like I said, bright sunny days, high pressure, that's when the fish might sit a little bit higher and they might go into the reeds for cover. This time of year, they use the deep water as cover a lot of the time, especially F1s. F1s love balling up in open water, basically wherever there's a bit of cover against the shelf. So it might look like, you know, you're dobbing in the middle of nowhere, but there's actually a reason behind it. So I'm going to go a little bit further down my peg this side. Got a couple more sections behind me so I can get right to the end of them reeds, chase them sort of to the limit of my peg. But like I say, if I don't get bites on this, once I've been all along that far bank, then I can quite easily just take a section off and patrol the bottom of that far slope. And again, don't want to leave it there too long, 30 seconds, minute maximum. If you've not had a bite, take your rig out, try somewhere else. So I'm going to go back to this line where we've had some signs, because I want to confirm that the rud, we've not actually caught one yet, but you know, through experience of fishing this venue, I know pretty much they are rud. So looking at the bread rig itself, I'll start with the elastic. The elastic for this is yellow hydro. The reason for this is it's a soft elastic, so when you hook fish, you're not going to sort of spook the rest of the fish that may be in your peg, the shoal if you like. The fish will sort of hopefully glide out of the peg, but also F1s in particular this time of the year, they're a little bit lethargic, so anything sort of heavier in this, and sometimes you end up pulling them around and you ping them off. So having a real nice soft elastic that's cushioning that fish helps you to bring them round, because sometimes you can be fishing down your peg quite far. Just makes for more landed fish and more fish in the net. Line itself, so the main line is 015 N gauge, and that's basically a back shot, so one number 9, probably about 8-10 inches above the float. This is actually set for my deep water fishing at the minute, so it's probably just under 3 foot deep. The float itself, if you look at the bristle, I've got a 1.5mm bristle on this. You don't want anything less than a 1.5. When your bread takes on water, it makes it a lot heavier. So if you fish with too fine a bristle and try and be too nice and too delicate, sometimes it can actually sink your bristle. So the float itself is an F1 Wilkie Slim, and it's in the wire version as well. So why am I using wire? I'm using wire because I don't want the rig to skim about. And then it's 0.3 of a gram, so I've got a little bit of weight there. Don't want it too light because, again, I don't want it moving. Coming down to the actual bulk, so the bulk is going to pretty much stay in the same position all day. I've got 5 number 9s there. If I slide that float right down, that is perfect for dobbing across, but at the minute I've been dobbing in the deep water, so I've slid it up, and that's for my deep water dobbing. And then coming down, I've got 3 number 12 droppers here. So the first one's about 4 inches from the bulk, then they're spaced out a little bit further apart as I get down my rig, and that just allows for a nice natural waft and a nice slow fall. What you've got to remember with bread, you're not feeding, so you've got to make sure that you locate them and then you give them time to see any bait falling past them, and that's the only way you can really encourage them to feed any quicker. And then moving on to the hook length, I've got a hook length of 011 N gauge. I've got that in 4 inches, and then to finish that off, I've got an 18s SLWG, which is perfect for sort of 6mm puncher bread. If you was catching bigger fish, you could step your hook length up a little bit, you could step your hook size up a little bit, but for F1s, I think an 18s is perfect. So yeah, that's the rig in general, that's your general bread rig. Nice and simple, just make sure you've got that nice slow fall. That bulk will never move, it'll pretty much stay 18-20 inches from my hook at all times. So there we go, we've got one eventually. Not what we're after, but it just confirms to me that, you know, there isn't a million F1s there, and that's actually what's sat in front of that weed bed. So I'm going to have a little patrol along that far bank, and then if we don't catch on that, we'll be talking about fishing in that deeper water. So I've gone all along that far bank and I've not really caught anything other than rud. My next port of call now would to be look into that deeper water, because if the fish are not sat on the shelf and I can't locate them there, they must be somewhere else. So before I introduced any bait into my peg, I'm going to search along the bottom of the far shelf, because if I can find some fish, if they don't want to feed, me putting some maggots in isn't really going to do anything. So I've got to then go to the fish. So my next step now, I've got my marker on my pole. I was about 8 inches off the bottom fishing across. It's about a foot and a bit deeper down the track than it is across. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to slide my float up. So again, I'm probably about 8 inches off the bottom, but at the bottom of that far slope. So in that deeper water. Like I say, it's not a very deep peg, so I'm probably only about 3 and a bit foot here. So I'm going to take a 6mm punch, 6mm punch of bread, make sure it's compressed. Like I say, you can compress it on your knee. There's no set rule to this, but just make sure that it's compressed so it sinks. You don't want to leave it uncompressed, because then your bread will float. So what I'm going to look to do now is go along the bottom of that far slope. I've already got an imaginary sort of marker in my head, and that is, if I go into the shadow of the reeds, I'm on the shelf. If I stay on the edge or just this side of the shadow of the reeds, I'm in the deep water. So when you look at it on camera there, you probably think, wow, you're in the middle of no man's land. But there's an underwater feature there, and that is that far slope. That far slope, the fish might be sat just in the deeper water and just be swimming along it. You know, they might not want to go into that 2.5 foot on top of the slope because it's too shallow, too clear. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to work my way to my right and slowly keep adding sections. And what will happen is when you find the fish, you'll drop it in, nothing, nothing, nothing. All of a sudden, you'll drop it a foot further or 6 or 8 inches further. Your float will go under, and on them good days, you'll know that you've found some fish. Now, them fish won't stay there all day. You know, they might stay in an area if there's angling pressure and it sort of keeps them there. But what you've got to be aware of is, like, the fish can move either side of your float. So you might catch a couple of fish, and just because you haven't had a bite, say, this side of my float, doesn't mean to say that I won't catch fish and spook the shoal this way. So all of a sudden then, you can also catch to your left where you didn't catch originally. So don't ever dismiss, oh, I didn't get a bite there early, I'm not going to try there again. So there, I've not had a bite, I'm just going to pick that rig back up. And I always find it best, rather than just lifting and dropping, I always try and find it best to sort of flick that rig towards where you feel like the fish are, so it's coming past the nose, if you like. So here, I'm right on the end of my 13-metre section. If I don't get a bite there now, I've got to sort of the limit of my section. I can't go any further. I'm going to have to put another section on and try a little bit further down the peg. So there, I've not had any signs. I'm going to pick another section up, and I'm going to just go down my section, probably another foot, and then just flick that rig past where I'm fishing again with that long line, trying to keep it away from the fish, and just see if anything happens there. So again, I'm only going to sit there 30, 45 seconds, minute maximum. If it doesn't go, I'll be flicking it a little bit further, until I get some signs. I've not had a single sign from what I think is a proper fish yet. So this is where you can waste a lot of time, you see. And this is where, especially if you're match fishing and you've got 5 hours, like I said before you know it, an hour's gone and you're like, wow, not even done anything. But likewise, if nobody's getting a bite on the lake, there's absolutely no advantage in feeding, because the fish are probably not feeding, and that's generally the case when it's really cold. So if I don't get a bite there, again, I'm only going to leave it 35, 40 seconds. I'm going to go to the end of my 14.5, pick it up, give it a little flick, a little bit further down the peg, all the time staying in line with that imaginary line where I know I'm in the deep water. So I've got one more section to go up the back of this, and this is a common thing in winter, is like sometimes you can't reach the fish. Like, I know there's definitely a few fish in that open water down to my right, but they're probably 30 metres away from me. Now, if you was in a match, there'd be an angler on that peg, and obviously that would be his peg. So he'd be the one who'd be on the majority of the fish today. He'd be the one who'd be able to reach the fish. All you can do is wait for him to try and catch a few and scatter some fish towards you, you know, and then sometimes you'll start catching yourself then because the fish will push towards you. With dobbing, if they're not there, and not just dobbing, but any sort of tactic, if the fish are not there, you can't catch them. So there's no, oh, I'll fill it in with loads of bait and hopefully the fish will turn up. There's none of that. It's all about location, and then when you drop on a few, hopefully you get an odd bite and you can catch an odd fish doing so. So I'm going to put one more section on, just get right to the limit of my peg. So I'm going to go halfway down my 16 metre section, give that a little flick. Got another foot and a half, 18 inches behind me, and then that literally will be the limit of my peg then. I'd be in line with the next platform. I wouldn't be able to go any further because I'd be encroaching, like I said, on another angler. So if you was in a situation here now in a match, you'd be thinking, I've not had a bite anywhere in my peg. Now you'd be thinking, well, if this next little flick doesn't go under and you've been everywhere where you think they are, then it's going to be time to feed, and that's when you're going to have, you know, you've got no other choice but to try and draw some fish towards you. With bread, they're not magically just going to turn up. They're either in your peg or they're not. But with maggots, you can entice, when you're feeding a little bit of bait, you can entice the odd fish that's maybe swimming about, that's not quite shoaled up with loads of other fish, just an odd resident fish in your peg. You might entice one or two of them just to have a little bit of a feed then. So one last flick, and I've just seen a fish top up there. So they're topped in the same spot. There's probably been half a dozen fish that have topped in the same spot right on the end of the island. I know 100% there's fish up there, but I'm too far away for them to catch. You know, me feeding is not going to draw them fish down either. You know, they probably just sit up there out of the way, and this is a problem when you're pleasure fishing. You know, if you are going out pleasure fishing, try and sit on a lake where, one, it's a little bit wider part of the lake, but also like with a couple of anglers on. Sometimes you don't want to box yourself in and sit too close to other anglers when you're pleasure fishing. But if there's an odd person on the lake, the fish are going to be getting moved about. If you just sat there on your own, it's generally not the best idea in winter, because the fish will literally back away from you. As it gets milder, the fishing will be brilliant because you'll have feeding fish that will want to come towards you, want to feed, and you'll have brilliant days. But when they don't want to feed, they'll just back away. So I'm going to have one last flick. I'm right on the limit of my peg now, 16 metres, as far as I can get down my peg. If I can't catch them here, then I'm going to have to feed some maggots then. So as you can see, I'm not on my box, and you might be thinking, what's he doing here? Well, I'm going to try and capture a fish for the cameras. I feel like I've seen the same sort of 6 or 8 fish top in the same sort of spot. So I've got the deep water rig set up, so I'm probably fishing sort of 3 foot deep here. And I feel like the fish, if they're going to be balled up, they're going to be balled up off the end of this point, which is a common holding spot for this venue. So I'm going to drop my rig in, try and catch one for you. Now what could happen here is I could literally go in, catch a fish, and they'd move again. Like, that is typical of, you know, winter F1 fishing. When they don't want to feed, they'll just constantly keep backing off you. Now, when you're on the lake on your own, it's a lot harder because you've nobody to push the fish back, so they'll go out of reach and you won't be able to get to them. But when you're in a match situation, sometimes people can push fish back towards you. So I'm sat down here and I'm going to basically go straight to where I think the fish are. So off the edge of that point, just see if we can catch one on camera, just to sort of prove the point to you watching and to myself as well, that, you know, it's not that you're doing anything wrong. If you're not on the fish, you just won't get a bite. You have to be right on where the fish are as well. Like I said it before, if you're a foot away from them, you won't get a bite. You drop it in another little foot. Don't mean to say that they're all within a foot, so a little indication on my float then. It's not that the fish are all within a foot, it's just that they circulate a certain area. So you might find that when you're closer to the shelf, you're closer to the bottom, and they might intercept the bait. The further away from the shelf you are, the further obviously you're off the bottom. The fish might sit deeper when you're in the deepest part of your peg. when you get closer to that shelf, you can catch them a little bit shallower. And what I mean by that is, say it's 6 foot the maximum depth, what you might find is 6 foot, the fish might sit at 4 foot. But if it's only 5 foot, you know, the slope's starting to change, the fish might sit at 3.5 foot, so you might catch them a little bit shallower. When you go on top of the shelf, if it's 3 foot, you might catch them 2 foot, for example, or 2.5 foot. So, I'm just gonna flick that rig just a little bit beyond my pole tip. Just have a little go there. Not easy sat down, holding 16 metres. But it'd be great if we could just catch one here. I just feel like we're a lot closer to the fish. If I was sat on my box, this would probably be about 30-35 metres away from where I'm actually fishing. So as you can see, we dropped in on this line trying to catch a fish, but the fish have instantly backed off. You know, when I first got to the peg and I felt like there was a few fish there, I dropped my plummet in, I could feel an odd fish with a plummet. Using my deep water rig, just pulling it off the bottom slightly, and bump, you'd feel a fish. So I knew there was some fish on the edge of that point. I've dropped in, hoping to just demonstrate that I knew they were there in my heart of hearts, but literally not a bite. They've moved instantly. Like, that's how scared they are today. And you know, a lot of people think, you know, when you come out filming that it's easy, you've got all the lake to yourself. It can be the worst thing in the world in winter sometimes. So, you know, it's one thing to take note of. Try and sit. If you're going out pleasure fishing, match situations, you're all right because the fish will push back into range. Today, we've got nobody to push the fish back. So literally, they'll just constantly keep backing away from you. So it didn't work. I was hoping to get one on camera for you, but to be honest, it's really hard work in the winter. But as long as you stick to that principle and you know where to dob, deep water or shallow water, you explore your peg. When you're on fish, I promise you, you will catch some fish doing this. Now, we're going to have to feed some bait, so next step, we'll jump back on the box, we'll talk a bit about maggots, talk about some deep water maggots. What I'm going to do is give away this punch box, so somebody's going to have a chance to win this. All you've got to do is like and subscribe to the YouTube channel, that's Tackle Guru TV, and comment in the section below this video. If you comment with, say, your favourite winter venue or your favourite dobbing venue in the winter, we'll pick a random winner from the comments below, and this could be on its way to you.